Morning, everybody. How we doing today? This is Blue Note Part 2, my favorite Blue Note records. I'm trying not to pick an artist twice, because you could go ahead and pick 15 Hank Mobley records and call it a day. So I'm trying to keep different artists in the mix here, but and it's a pretty impossible task. You would never pick the same 15 favorite Blue Notes a month, week, a year later. It's just such a great canon, and I'm just trying to expose a lot of great records and some deeper stuff, and just beyond the blue trains, something else's, and the real obvious, blues walk. There's a lot of great Blue Note stuff, and anyone who's a deeper jazz fan knows the breadth and depth of the Blue Note canon. One thing I would like is if people who are watching this episode, if you could just tell me how long you've been watching. Purely as a way for me to gauge my content. I want to know how much I should be repeating stuff I did last spring, last summer, or how much that stuff is. Do I have the same 500 people watching every episode with a few newcomers? Or out of my 2,000 subscribers, is it just a different group every time watching? I know about 40% is actually non-subscribers watching each episode. So I'm curious, do I have 90% of the same people watching every time who already knows what I've said? Or is half or more of my audience new consistently? So just let me know if you consider yourself a regular, or if you consider yourself a relative newbie. Just so I know who I'm speaking to, so I can help gauge my content a little bit here. Because I don't want to find myself repeating what I've already said if it's the same people watching for the most part. And also, at the same time, I want to embrace new people who come to the channel, and I want them to understand a lot of what I'm about. And some of that stuff, the social context, the racial context, I don't delve into as much anymore because I've spoken about it a lot. But I do want the new people to realize how important I feel race and the social constructs and economic constructs of America and the oppression of this group of people is what makes this art special. And those of you who watched me for a year have heard me say it 100 times. But those who are new, I reference it now and then, but I don't really delve into it as deep as I did last year. And for obvious reasons. So just give me an idea if you wouldn't mind. Long-timer or newbie. Just give me an idea. And thanks to those who do. I also want to thank my Patreon subscribers. You guys have been a wonderful help in this time. My unemployment's about to run out. I think Minnesota just renewed it for a few more months, thankfully. But I'm living on $300 a week, so that extra $300-400 a month from Patreon does help me pay my bills right now. It's been a tough year financially for me. I haven't had a chance to buy much music either. Thankfully, I do have most of what I'm looking for, but there still are titles I do want to find, and a lot of them are pretty tough. There's about 9 Savoys I just can't track down from 60-61, and the label was kind of transitioning at that point. I think their sales must have been pretty low, because finding original copies of these, and there are more in demand titles, because they're kind of been more hardbop, moving into the avant-garde stuff coming out in that era. Anyway, let's get back to Blue Note. Blue Note is, as I said in the last episode, has a special place in the jazz canon. And each label, as you get to know them, has a sound. And the Blue Note sound is clearly defined in 57 through 60, even into 61. It's the sound of hard bop, aggression, rhythm and groove, honesty and tension. It's very clear what the Blue Note sound is. And some of the developments that happen on the label later help keep the label alive or help keep it relevant to some people. But it's not the Blue Note sound necessarily. Boogaloo is more the Blue Note sound probably than the avant-garde titles that come in the 60s. But Boogaloo, because Boogaloo's so rooted in the blues and swing and groove and rhythm, R&B, so But Boogaloo does feel different than the hard bop stuff. And the hard bop stuff is what the Blue Note sound is. And every label has a defining sound. It would be the consensus of original addition to the canon. That would be what a label's sound is. And some labels, it's easier to define that than others. And for me, the clarity of what the Blue Note sound is can't be more finite. It's a very clear thing what Blue Note brought to the jazz world. And it continues to be a very important label in the 60s, but it's certainly not the cutting edge and the saber that slices through that it was in 57, 58, 59, where Blue Note is the edge, the development, the advancement in the sound and the look and the feel of what jazz was saying and doing. Some labels are never even lucky enough to get that moment. Savoy has their moment in the 40s where they're the cutting edge. Prestige dabbles with, but their sound is so loose, so unrehearsed, so unproduced. So if anything, the Prestige sound is just that kind of blowing session, junky jazz. You know, that's kind of the Prestige sound a little bit. A lot of those records are frenetic, but not in an avant-garde sense. They're frenetic in a unrehearsed, oh, we both started the play, I guess it's your turn, not mine, my bad. Like that kind of freneticism. It's very loose, and it's great because it's very open to expression and to emoting, which is what improvisation is all about. And again, I think I haven't really stressed that point very often lately, but improvisation is the very essence of emoting, expressing my emotional state. And that's why I want, when people question, is jazz really about speaking about your experiences and your community? Yes, of course it is. As much as a rapper is speaking about his existence and his experience into a microphone, a jazz musician is going to be emoting that same experience. And unlike pop and hip hop, there's a dishonesty that comes with lyrics, with words. It can be fabricated, it can be molded, it can be shaped into a certain image to fit a certain genre. A jazz player can't fake it. You can't blow hard bop if you ain't hard bop. You just can't do it. You know, you can't pretend to be something you're not. You either feel what you're playing or you don't play. You know, and that's what the great thing was. What the blues is that almost everybody has the blues at some time. Black, white, young, rich, old, don't matter. The blues hits us all at some times. But the militancy of hard bop, the powerful honesty of it, that's not something a lot of jazz cats have in their repertoire. And I was talking with a few of my black friends just the other day, and I think it's hard for the white people to understand that black music has always spoken for the community at large. It's always reflected the place the black community itself feels within America. Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington represent how the black male carried themselves in the 20s and 30s. It was a bit of a contentment to be surviving and making a living. We have it better than my grandparents did back in the 1800s. We're going to be thankful. We're not thrilled about the oppression that still surrounds us, but we're still going to be kind of forgiving. And I wouldn't call it complacent, but I would say they're thankful for their ability to survive, doing what they love for a living, in spite of the ugliness around them. They're not going to confront that because they're just happy to not be dead, to not be in chains. And so Armstrong's generation looked at their place as a black male with a different lens than the generation that comes in the 50s and 60s that was born in the Depression, lived through the wars, served in Korea, saw all this promise of change and had to have none of it to be delivered. And so the militancy and potency of hard bop is absolutely a reflection of the black male in the late 50s and early 60s. It's where the mindset had become for this new generation. And the Byrds and the Mobleys and the Lee Morgans and the John Coltrane's, even the Miles Davises, these guys had a new framework from which they were expressing and emoting as a black community. And white music doesn't have that same breadth. There's not very many examples of white music that represents and stands for all white culture. We're too dissipated. There's very few white music genres that the entire white community embraces and listens to equally. There's moments where we kind of had some of that. I think with the early concentration of the classic rock movement, some of even the protest hippie songs, we got certain elements, but there was a whole establishment of the white community that resented it and wanted to oppress that music. Black music always speaks for the young, the old, the disenfranchised, and those who were upwardly mobile. Old black people usually appreciate some of the young stuff, and the young kids usually know a lot about James Brown. There's a real embrace of what our black community has accomplished, and you can generationally feel the developments of the black male's mindset and how it's impacting the music. And as hard as the Verve Cats blow in the 50s on those great Verve records, they're expressing from a different mindset than the stuff happening at the same time at Blue Note. So at Eldridge, Sweets Edison, Coleman Hawkins, those records can be absolutely insane. Ben Webster, and they can be blowing, playing the blues, swinging hard as anything. But it's not coming across with this acerbic, frustrated, enough is enough. It's got more joy to it. It's got more celebration, more, boy, I feel pretty good right now in spite of all of this. And that new, younger black male doesn't express from that place. Mobley has moments of that forgiveness, that let's focus on the positive kind of attitude that you hear a lot in the swing cat era players. But no matter how hard a Verve session blows, and they blow hard, they're expressing and emoting in different state of mind. And the Blue Note sessions from that same period, those hard bop records are blowing so hard because of the emotional frustration, the angst-ridden, we're so fed up. And what was okay for my grandparents or even my parents, it's not good enough for me and my friends anymore. And that continues into the 70s with the funk movement, in the 80s with the hip-hop, and 90s with the hip-hop movement. Each generation of black male expects things to be a little bit better. And the music keeps delivering that message. And honestly, it also delivers some of the promised repercussions if it's denied to us. We can't go on living like this much longer. You know, we do our best to bite our tongue and hold the peace. But you're going to push us to a place where I'm proud to be a black man. And you can't keep taking that away from my dignity. You can't keep taking away my sense of self. There's a show on TV called Chicago PD. And me and the wife have been watching it. And in this last season, season 7, the black cop, he's a comedian in real life, the Royce Hawkins, he kind of goes from being a street cop into this intelligence unit. And they used this character really cleverly, the writers, to reveal the bridge between the black cop and the black man. And the conflicts that he has to deal with when he has to almost choose sides every day, how he wants to see things that are unfolding. And the end of season 7, it really puts him in a state where a known racist cop profiles a black kid. A couple of guys end up dead. The cop ends up dead. And the cops all want just to cover the racist cop's tracks. And as a black man, he's more black than he is blue. And he's seen in the car watching this guy who wasn't even on duty profile and start shit with these black guys. And he couldn't live with himself by being part of the lie. And then the cops close rank on him. And with season 8, the first 2 episodes are out, and they don't really have any more episodes because of the virus. But it's really dealing with the Black Lives Matter, and the conflicts in Chicago are as tenable and as explosive as any place in the world. And a lot of Americans don't realize that a lot of Europeans see us as South Africa still. They see us like with this apartheid and injustice and don't really understand how we can be so tolerant and not recognize the injustice that still surrounds us and we live in every day. And so transitioning back to jazz, it's pretty clear that no matter how hard the swing cats can blow, and they can blow hard, it's coming from a different place as the generation that's in this period. And Blue Note captures that like no other label. There's no other label that speaks about this experience as honestly up until this point. And of course, by the mid-60s, words do start coming into the picture. And so Sam Cooke, A Change Is Gonna Come. Sly Stone, There's a Riot Going On. Curtis Mayfield, the Roots record, and Superfly, and what he starts to represent about America and speaking on America. Marvin Gaye's What's Going On. Stevie Wonder's Talking Book, Inner Vision, Songs in the Key of Life. That's another next generation mentality of the black male. Now being able to use words and vocabulary to express inner city blues. And of course, there's a next level of militancy beyond that. When you get into Rakim and Chuck D and KRS-One, the Sounds of the Police, KRS-One is dropping some very serious knowledge. And it's amazing how little things changed. And George Floyd last year tells us that things haven't changed much at all. And that's the weirdest thing about black music today is I don't really hear that voice anymore. And I'm not super following what the kids are doing, but most of them are just depressed, looking like Kanye. Something's happened. The assimilation has entrenched the music and sold it out. The music industry has watered it down. And that's part of the problem with the American music industry. It's so driven by dollars and bottom line. And when it was profitable to make that music, they were all about it. But even the trap house music of today, it's not anti-cop. It's about how much ice you got. What kind of Lambo are you rolling in? And that's so against the grain of what the black community has always spoken of. Let's not support white business and make somebody else rich. Let's support our communities. That's what the Black Panthers were talking about. It's not about necessarily a militancy because we want to be militant. It's about we're going to start food kitchens and distribute textbooks so we can have a higher educated black male to make things better for us in the future. And that was untenable to the CIA and the FBI. It's mind-blowing. But moving on. Blue Note. It's such a special chapter. And I've been playing this fantastic Herbie Nichols record. And I've spoken on him a few times in episodes. This is number 1519. And a friend of Thelonious Monk, and if you listen here, those angles, that percussive choppy walk, it's very reminiscent of Monk. And apparently they cross-germinated. They were pretty interesting little comminglers in New York. And Max Roach performs on this, as well as Bob Shad, Al McKibben, Teddy Kodak's on a couple tracks as well. But Herbie, I believe he was Trinidadian descent, but a New York born and raised kid. And he has this wonderful angular loping sound. And if you had to put him somewhere, you'd put him somewhere between Monk Powell with edges of Horace Silver. He has some stride and some groove, but he also has those real interesting blocks and angles and chops and delivers a sound that if you're a Monk fan, you'll love Herbie Nichols. He has 2 10-inches on Blue Note before this, and he also has a great record on Bethlehem that's super hard to find. He was introduced, if I recall, to Alfred Lion as early as the late 40s, and Alfred Lion kind of hesitated to record him, but he finally does in like 53, 54 with those 2 10-inches. And it's kind of one of the underappreciated Blue Note titles, but it's certainly worthy of a lot of praise and recognition. He's a great player that I feel like is starting to get some due nowadays. Next record I want to cover here is the fantastic John Jenkins If I recall, he's a Chicago guy that made his way to New York. And he's a pretty prominent guy in the scene throughout the late 50s and early 60s. He doesn't get a lot of recordings as a leader, at least not that I know of on the main jazz labels. I can't remember, he might have a few things on other labels, but he's a great player. And of course he's got the great Kenny Burrell on this. And we're going to talk about Kenny in a few albums here today. I'm a huge Kenny Burrell fan. He's got some Coltrane sound to him right there. That sounds like the brisk intensity of Coltrane. Of course, that is an alto, but it still sounds like John on the soprano or on the high register of the tenor. It's got that tonality, that almost nasal integrity. He so means it that it's got a hint of nasalness. It just sits in your gut and sticks there. Sonny Clark, Paul Chambers, and Danny Richmond round this session out. Danny Richmond, of course, played drums for Mingus for a decade and is a huge part of the Mingus sound. Chambers, of course, is a legend, and Sonny Clark, who we spoke about in the other episode yesterday, is a fantastic hard bop player that was a lot of the focus of the hard bop sound at Blue Note. You gotta love Sonny Clark. But what I love about Kenny Burrell is he's not just an accompanist. He has this incredible ability to graft himself into whatever session he's assigned. And speaking of session work, the guy's on hundreds of records. I've highlighted in my printout books all the records I have with him on them, and there's probably 50 or 60 of him as a leader. But even as a side work, there's probably 200 records where Kenny Burrell shows up, and he's capable of doing a melancholy Christmas album with some real integrity and blues. He can do hard bop sessions. He can do Guitar Hero records. He can do pretty much anything that he puts his guitar playing to. This is my little friend Little Butt. Little Butt is crawling along up by my camera. She was about to bump it, so I gotta set her down. But I love Kenny Burrell. He's one of my favorites. One of the guys I can really listen to at almost any time, and I'll never be like, oh, I'm not in the mood for that. I always love Kenny Burrell. I love almost all jazz guitar as a caveat, but there's Kenny Burrell manages to make even kind of commercial, watered down, mainstream label records interesting by having him on them. Which there's some jazz players on the guitar who that can't be said about. You know, even the great Wes Montgomery, who's probably the greatest jazz guitar player ever, makes some pretty commercial sessions, especially when he's at Verve. Grant Green is just a great blues player, and the Blue Note sound part of what he does is soul jazz. But you talk about guys like Al Caiola and some of those other players, they make some pretty saccharine commercial pop, jazz, holiday rap. Like, there's a lot of schlock in jazz guitar. And Burrell can take anything and put a real flavor to it that I can always be like, yeah, that's integrity. He's not compromising himself by doing this. He's putting some legitimate jazz and blues in everything he does. This is the great Benny Green. He's a bit like a Lou Donaldson or a Thad Jones. He's a bit outside of the nucleus of Blue Note. And that core of Blue Note musicians were the angry young hard boppers, and Benny Green's more of a swing, blues-driven cat. Super great lyrical player. He's not playing with the dexterity of a J.J. Johnson or a Jimmy Cleveland or the ferocity and tempo of Curtis Fuller. He's more about playing sweet melody that swings and tells you a story, and that's the blues. The blues always has a story to tell us. They round up Charlie Rouse for this session. 1587 makes it about probably 1558. Louis Hayes, George Tucker, and Joe Knight on the piano. And I can't tell you much about Joe Knight, to be honest. But that's the thing about some of these guys that are not quite part of the Blue Note core. You're going to have some sidemen that you're not going to know quite as well on their records. But Charlie Rouse, of course, goes on to great things with Monk, and it's a great sidemen. His Jazz Modes records are outstanding. All the stuff with Julius Watkins, but this also one of my favorite album covers. I like the Thad Jones record we showed you last time. That cover is just classic New York. It's a look I try to capture in a lot of my graphics for my episodes that open the episodes. I love that gritty urbanity that, to me, jazz encapsulates. Jazz is urban. Jazz is not rural. The blues is rural. Jazz is the blues urbanized. Even the instruments we have to play this music on changes in the city. We have access to French horns here in the city that you don't get in rural Mississippi. The aforementioned Lou Donaldson, I want to recommend this record to people who are skeptical about the great Lou Donaldson. And he's often known for Alligator Boogaloo and kind of a boogaloo soul jazz movement, which, as a guy who was a decade or so older than most of the other guys, the soul jazz movement was a perfect thing for him to jump into, with a lot of genuine integrity. That's what he was about. But he's very much a kid in the bebop. He's going through all the bebop, and he can play the bebop with the best of them. And when Lou does hard bop, which he only does in a few records, having the chops of bebop makes playing hard bop pretty easy for him. And he has this record right here stands above most of his catalog just because of how ferocious it is. And again, Sonny Clark. That's just what Clark does to a session. He makes it serious. It's like Clark brings you into a huddle before we start playing a note and says, guys, there's a war going on. And let's not forget that. Dip your arrows, light the fires, whatever you got to do. I got to go put some junk in my arm to get to the place I got to get to cleanse myself. And Clark did have a bad habit, which became a prevalent problem for the black communities and the black neighborhoods of that time. But Donald Byrd, Curtis Fuller, and Lou Donaldson are a great trio. They really complement each other well. And Byrd is a very malleable player. He can really adjust what he does based on who he's playing with. That's one of the reasons why I really am a fan of Donald Byrd. He's Morgan's always kind of a Morgan. You know, Hubbard's always Hubbard. Byrd has a bit more elasticity to his sound. It's less defined what his sound is, so it allows it to actually encompass more things sometimes and play more effortlessly in different settings. You put Hubbard on any record, there's going to be some blister. Hubbard can't help himself. He's full of blah. You know, you can't put Clifford Brown on a record and not expect 9 miles an hour melody. He'll run you out the road in a sweet way. And Curtis Fuller, as we just talked about, one of the great trombone players of the hard bop sound and era. And this was his era at Blue Note, 57, 58, 59. Fuller's on a lot of stuff at Blue Note. And oddly enough, he joins the Jazz Messengers in 60. And he doesn't get any more leadership albums at Blue Note, but he's recording as a sideman with the Messengers at Blue Note in the 60s. His leadership titles go to other labels at that point. But George Joyner and Art Taylor, and Art Taylor's ubiquitous. He's a bit like Paul Chambers. He's on so many records across the jazz label universe. There's Fuller. You'll find Art Taylor just his home at Prestige, Riverside, or Blue Note. He's pretty much everywhere all the time. A bit like Paul Chambers. We talked about Kenny Burrell a little bit ago, and this is one of my favorite Kenny Burrell records. Man, Fuller's killing it right there. Fuller's chopping it down. People forget how hard trombone is to play. The breath capacity, the dexterity, the not defined tone of a trumpet valve or a saxophone pad, a trombone. You gotta push that valve to try to find the sound. And so to be able to enunciate clearly in a hard bop or bebop sense takes a great amount of ability. Endless rehearsal. And that was one of the most fantastic trombone solos I've heard. It always kind of blows me away, and it's really Fuller at a high place right there. Jimmy Cleveland, noteworthy. And those of you who don't know who Jimmy Cleveland is, he's a sideman on infinite sessions in the Jazz Kingdom. Over the course of 20 years, Cleveland's everywhere. But he has a couple great records at Emerson as a leader. But he seems to have kind of just settled into being a hired gun, Jimmy Cleveland. But as I've said in other episodes, and again, I'm not sure how often I should repeat myself with some of this stuff, but there's been umpteen times where while listening to something, reading a book, all of a sudden I was like, who the fuck was that on the trombone? And it was Jimmy Cleveland every time. And this guy I hardly even knew. But over the course of 2 or 3 years, a dozen times I was like, damn, who just blew that out the trombone? And you go look, it's like, oh shoot, Jimmy Cleveland. Jimmy Cleveland's dexterity is just phenomenal and next level. Al Gray's another great trombone player, but Al Gray is about tricks and mutes and making some sounds you never heard before, whereas Jimmy Cleveland's a more traditional sounding trombone player with this incredible dexterity. Kenny Burrell, here you have him in a hard bop-ish setting. It's got Art Blakey, which is going to keep it pretty thundering and well driven. The band also has, I think, Roland Hanna's in it on a couple tracks. Bobby Timmons is on a lot of it, and Timmons is, of course, a great jazz messenger. Ben Tucker's on the bass. And then you got Tina Brooks, who is new to the label around this time. He's about to put his own first record out. He guests on Freddie Hubbard's record we showed you in the last episode, Open Sesame, and it kind of buries his own release, True Blue, which is coming up here next, I believe, or soon anyway, and it's a great record. But Tina Brooks, another guy who had a drug problem and ended up stepping away from the music way too soon. We didn't get enough from Tina Brooks, but he's a great player. But there's Burrell, his dexterity, his rhythmic pulse, his melodic structure. It's all was very pleasing to my ear. I could soak up a lot of his playing for days. And Burrell's one of the guys that I played a lot at my DJ gigs. He just always was a nice, soft place to play for people in a public venue. A record that's somewhat underappreciated. And it's hard to say that about Blue Note because Blue Notes are so ubiquitous in the marketplace. If you join any Facebook jazz group, you'll see pretty much every Blue Note title over the course of a few years posted. They're all so available, so in print, all over the world. So many reissues have been done of almost every title. I don't know if there's a Blue Note title out there, especially of the actual canon, that hasn't been reissued 5 times. And so they're preeminent and prominent in the jazz landscape.